Welcome to the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast. On this show, we will discuss the assaults on our liberty by the very institution we the people created to secure our liberty. We will also compare and contrast the actions of people in leadership positions to the servant leadership that is needed to protect our God-given, constitutionally protected rights. Additionally, we will break down the many lies that elected and unelected officials in government and media spin every day in order to secure for themselves positions of power and influence that are antithetical to the system of government our founding fathers created and passed down to us. Boy, is it great to be back home this week, folks. Let me say first, good Monday morning to you all. Even though my last 3-week engagement did seem to fly by, it is always great to wake up in your own bed each day. Home sweet home is a feeling and a phrase that I believe many people take for granted. My last 3-week engagement was a doozy for travel. My feet touched the ground in 8 different states, a few of them a couple of times, 3 different time zones, and 5 different airports. I also put more than 1,000 miles of windshield time in, both in the company truck and in a rental vehicle, driving to many different locations in 4 of those 8 states. It was an experience, let me tell you. My future coaching engagements will keep me mostly in Wyoming, North and South Dakota, as well as Montana for the remainder of the year. I wasn't looking forward to the heat and humidity of Mississippi on my previous engagements, but I am looking less forward to the winter weather in those states. But the work must go on, if you know what I mean. I posted on social media a bit about my travels and how it was good to be home. And the following morning, my bride and I ran into a friend at the local Lowe's parking lot. He jokingly mentioned how I wasn't even home for 24 hours yet, and I was already working on the honey-do list because I was loading up some materials into the truck. Speaking of the truck, the beast. It was also great driving that after spending the previous 2 weeks riding around the countryside in a small-sized SUV. I'm not the tallest of individuals, but even I enjoy the roominess of my truck. Not to mention the power of the 6.6-liter V8 4-wheel drive monster that it is. I also want to thank the listeners and followers again for the feedback on the podcast. Please continue to share these episodes with your circle of influence. If you're watching the show on Rumble, YouTube, or TikTok, make sure you give it a like or a thumbs up. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or any other podcast platform, do me a favor and give the show a review on those platforms. Based upon the feedback from my most valued listener, that would be my bride, in case you were wondering, I made some changes to the opening of the show. Since I am no longer a candidate for office, just a conservative activist here in Tennessee, I had to make some changes, not only to the show, but also to all my social media platforms. Now, with a recap complete, let's get on with this week's episode of the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast, where I will discuss why the threats to our liberty that are posed by national debt, government spending, and government censorship. So let's take a stand in the arena together again this week, folks, and get on with the show.
My dad, Larry Linton, the only true servant leader willing to stand in the arena and fight for your freedoms.
Larry is a man of God, and he will move heaven and earth to protect the people in district.
Too many elected politicians act like chameleons.
My name is Mike. I'm Larry's neighbor. I bought the house behind him. I trust Larry to give me an honest answer.
And what's important to me is faith, family, and my freedom. And I believe these values are also held by Larry Linton.
More important than ever, I believe, in our lifetime to really stand up and fight for what's right. And Larry's doing that, and I'm in support of it.
We need to replace career politicians in Nashville with leaders willing to stand for what is right, even if it's not popular. People who feel a calling and are not looking to make a profession out of it.
You're not going to find a more honest, straightforward, and passionate individual, I don't believe. Larry is what you see is what you get. He's honest.
Listen, if you are looking for a true conservative who's passionate about the state of Tennessee, the people that live in it, and wanting to make a difference in a meaningful way, Larry's your guy.
Okay, folks, let's get this show started. I hope you all noticed some of the changes I made to the introduction of the show. My brilliant bride, as I mentioned, reminded me that I was no longer a candidate for public office, and I probably never will be again. And I should probably take that out of the intro. So voila, a new intro to the show. Also, I haven't had any winners yet on letting me know what type of books the Nazis were burning in Germany in the 1930s. I went back and forth with a commie on social media for the past few days about this topic. It is amazing the lack of knowledge of history on the left side of the political spectrum. Rush Limbaugh used to say that for many people, especially for those on the left, their sense of history only relates to their own lifetimes and the information that is fed to them. Again, if you think you know the right answer about predominantly which types of books the Nazis were burning, just send an email to Larry at libertyleadershipandlies.com. Again, that is Larry at libertyleadershipandlies, all one word, .com. To my loyal followers, thank you for the feedback on last week's show. Your encouragement means the world to me. And speaking of last week's show, let me tell you that it really brought the commies out of the woodwork on the social media platforms it was shared on. The hate and vitriol those people spew, frankly, it's amazing. But it takes a back seat to their complete denial of facts. They are programmed to hate everything that is good and love everything that is bad for our country and bad for our liberty. They would be quite at home living in the gulags that they want to force Republicans to live in. As I stated in the intro, we are going to delve into one of the biggest threats to our liberty in the world today and how it stems from the fact that our government hates us. That big threat is our national debt. Oh, we aren't going to leave out the debt that the individual states place on the backs of their citizens either. In fact, let's kick off the threat of state debt to our liberty using a recent article from the great people over at Tennessee Conservative News. Just a few days ago, it was reported that the multi-billion-dollar auto manufacturing company that our illustrious Tennessee governor and supposedly supermajority Republican General Assembly gave nearly $1 billion to in taxpayers' money back in 2021. Well, that company has already announced earlier this year they were delaying production of electric trucks at Tennessee's Blue Oval City by several months. Then Ford Motor Company announced plans a couple of weeks ago that they would now be delaying the schedule even more. Under the original plans laid out a couple of years ago, when the government decided to engage in the non-governmental function of picking winners and losers in the free market, Ford stated that electric truck and battery production was supposed to start here in Tennessee next year in 2025. But Ford initially announced a delay just a few months ago, stating that the first electric pickup trucks would be available from the plant beginning in 2026. Now, Tennesseans should remember that this was all based upon a special session of the General Assembly that Governor Lee called for in 2021, while he was also engaged in the unconstitutional executive orders around the COVID scandemic. It was then that the Republican, quote unquote, supermajority, or actually, quote unquote, Republicans, joined together with a church pew Governor Lee to approve the budgeting of nearly $1 billion worth of taxpayer funds housed in the state's rainy day fund for that unconstitutional action. Now, what is the purpose of any government's rainy day fund, you may be wondering, and what does this have to do with state government debt and spending affecting our liberty? Well, let me explain. The primary purpose of a rainy day fund is to offset the impact of revenue declines and stabilize a state's fiscal position through economic ups and downs, or natural disasters, or declared states of emergency. Based upon that definition, many commies and establishment Republicans, or who I like to refer to as transpublicans, would say that the nearly $1 billion given to Ford Motor Company initially was done so to stabilize our state's fiscal position, which would be the case if the agreement and plans went off without a hitch. We know now that that isn't the case, because when you break this down to its fundamentals, the state government It was gambling with our taxpayer money, and they lost. So what happens when the state's rainy day fund is needed when the previously mentioned conditions do occur? The state of emergency or national disaster. Or when revenue declines. I think that's happening right now because of the record levels of inflation we are experiencing because of the national government's spending and printing of money. But what about the potential for natural disasters? If the rainy day fund is empty because the political elites in our state keep gambling and losing the money set aside in our rainy day fund, what happens next? Well, history is replete with examples, folks. Austerity measures, which impact the people and not the government, and then higher taxes, again, which impact the people and not the government. It's just another example of a couple of things. First, that our government hates us and only sees us as sources of revenue. Second, because of the apathy of the electorate, we get these fake conservatives in office who do not politically fear the population anymore. That is just one example, and only on the state level. There are many more times or examples we could cite where our state government has gambled with the people's money and lost. The problem is that government doesn't suffer the losses. The losses are always borne by the taxpayers. We taxpayers lose more than just the misspent tax dollars meant for quote unquote rainy days. We lose our liberty because the only way to make up for the losses incurred by the government is to take more from the people or to institute austerity measures. And because of the apathy of those same taxpayers, more often than not, those elected officials are never held accountable at the ballot box. In fact, in 2022, and this is only at the national level, which we're about to discuss concerning the national debt, the incumbency rate for re-election was a staggering 94.5%. Just like being a government employee, never being held accountable for mal or misfeasance, that's a rare occurrence. The same can be said for elected officials. They know it. And that is why they do not politically fear the people any longer. With that being said, let's move into the national debt. Today, our national debt sits at $35+ trillion. And the debt is climbing so fast that the numbers in the hundreds of thousands column, they are a blur to watch on the national debt clock. When I was thinking about this topic, it reminded me of a conversation I had many years ago with the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. Here is a photo of Admiral Mullen and I when he came to address the class at the United States Army Sergeants Major Academy back in 2011. We touched on that topic a bit when he took some time to address the Navy contingent of students that were in attendance at the time. It was not a new topic for him. In fact, Admiral Mullen is on record back in 2010 stating that the national debt was a top national security threat. At the time he addressed that with my fellow sailors and I down at Fort Bliss, the national debt was roughly $14 trillion. Remember, that was 2011. It has gone up $21 trillion since then in only 13 years. From 1789 to 2011, our elected so-called leaders accumulated $14 trillion in debt. That took 222 years. From 2011 to 2024, they accumulated an additional $21 trillion. And who pays that bill when it comes due, folks? You and I do. And because of the apathy of the people, the politically elite never pay a price. In fact, most of them become wealthier while serving in office and get reelected, while most of us Americans suffer the consequences of their bad decisions. So let's discuss the threat of national debt to national security, which in turn is a threat to our liberty. National debt is often viewed primarily as an economic concern, but it has increasingly become a significant threat to national security. As countries around the world, in addition to the United States, grapple with rising debt levels, the potential implications extend far beyond financial stability. Our nation's ability to protect our interests and maintain our sovereignty can be undermined by this excessive debt. One of the ways the national debt poses a threat is because it causes economic vulnerability and impacts military spending. One of the most direct ways that national debt threatens national security is by constraining military spending. High levels of debt often lead to increased interest payments, which consume a larger share of the national budget. In fact, interest payments on our national debt right now is the biggest part of our government spending. As noted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, this can limit our government's ability to allocate funds to defense and other security-related expenditures, potentially weakening military readiness and capability. The Heritage Foundation highlights that sustained high levels of debt could force a nation to make difficult trade-offs between funding defense initiatives and other domestic priorities. When debt servicing takes precedence, which it is right now, military modernization programs are delayed or canceled, which undermine our republic's defense posture, which in turn emboldens our enemies. Our national debt has created a dependence on foreign creditors. As noted by Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, a significant portion of national debt is often held by foreign entities. This can give creditor nations considerable leverage over our country's economic and foreign policies. Sometimes it leads to politically connected families selling their brand, if you know what I mean. For example, though, if a country becomes heavily indebted to a foreign power, let's say for a hypothetical China, right? It may make our new aristocracy reluctant to oppose that power's geopolitical ambitions, or may be pressured into unfavorable trade deals. Does that sound familiar? This dependency can be particularly concerning when creditor nations are geopolitical rivals. I think China is one of those, as they may use their economic leverage to extract concessions or weaken our nation's strategic position. Have you been paying attention for at least the last 8 years? All right, I've come up on a break, and there are more reasons why national debt is a threat to our national security and our liberty that I'm going to cover in a future episode. For now, though, when I come back, we're going to discuss the obvious government violation of every American's First Amendment rights through their censorship regime. There are some new revelations in the past couple of weeks that prove it, but many on the right are going after the wrong person in this situation. And we're going to discuss that. So stick with me. I'll be right back. And we're back for the final full segment, folks. As I mentioned in the last segment, there are many other ways in which the national debt poses a threat to our liberty. Too many more to put into one episode, actually, so I'll be saving the others for a future episode. Please do not forget to smash that like button or subscribe on whatever platform you watch or listen to this podcast on. For now, though, let's discuss the role censorship plays as a threat to liberty, our liberty. In order to do this, I'm going to discuss examples from history, and then we can compare and contrast them with what is occurring in our republic today. Totalitarian regimes throughout history have consistently utilized censorship as a powerful tool to maintain control over their populations. By manipulating information, suppressing dissent, and shaping public opinion, these regimes create an environment where the state's narrative is the only acceptable truth. With that being said, let's explore how various totalitarian regimes have implemented censorship to reinforce their power. We're going to be drawing on examples from Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Communist China, Fascist Italy, North Korea, and a contemporary example like what's going on in Russia right now. Let's start with Nazi Germany. Under Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany implemented one of the most notorious censorship regimes in history. The Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, controlled all forms of media, including newspapers, books, radio, and films. The regime banned and burned books that were considered un-German or subversive, particularly those written by Jewish authors or those promoting communist or pacifist ideologies. Now, let me be clear, that isn't the answer that I was looking for in the contest mentioned at the outset of this week's episode and during last week's episode. I specifically did not mention this one genre, so to speak, of books the Nazis were burning. If you provide me with the correct answer, I will send you a prize. But back to Germany's Ministry of Propaganda, though. This systemic censorship aimed to eliminate any ideas that could challenge Nazi ideology or mobilize opposition. As noted by historian Richard J. Evans, the Nazis were determined to establish a cultural monopoly and to shape the intellectual life of Germany according to their principles. Now, moving on to the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1991. The Soviet Union, particularly under Joseph Stalin, employed a sophisticated censorship system to control the flow of information and suppress dissent. The government tightly regulated all forms of communication, including the press, literature, theater, and even personal correspondence. The state-run agency, Glavlit, was responsible for pre-publication censorship, ensuring that only content that aligned with Soviet ideology reached the people. Dissident voices, such as those of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Boris Pasternak, they were censored, exiled, or silenced. What do you think that means? According to Robert Service, Stalin's censorship was more than a tool of repression. It was a means of constructing a new Soviet consciousness, a reality in which only the state's narrative was permissible. All of this should be sounding quite familiar. Next up in the queue are the Chi-Coms from 1949 to present day. Since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Communist Party has maintained strict control over information to consolidate its power. During the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976, the government, led by Mao, censored all cultural and intellectual activity that did not conform to Maoist thought. Books were banned, intellectuals were persecuted, and only propaganda supporting Maoist ideology was allowed. Even in contemporary China, censorship remains pervasive, particularly with the advent of the internet. The Great Firewall of China blocks access to foreign websites, social media platforms, and any content deemed subversive or harmful to state interest. Scholar Anne Marie Brady notes censorship in China is not just about blocking information, it's about shaping public perception to align with party ideology. Shades of George Orwell's 1984. And it's not limited to China, though. Are you noticing a pattern here? But next up is Fascist Italy from 1922 to 1943. That word fascist is tragically funny in today's context. Well, with Antifa and their supporters all over the country using fascist tactics and methodology in their so-called anti-fascist agenda. Heck, even their wardrobe is strikingly similar to the 1930s and 1940s in Germany and Italy. But anyway, under Benito Mussolini, fascist Italy also employed censorship as a means of maintaining control. The regime suppressed political opposition and controlled the press, radio, and let's not forget film industries to propagate fascist ideology. The Ministry of Popular Culture was responsible for overseeing all media content, ensuring that it aligned with the regime's objectives. Mussolini understood the power of media in shaping public opinion and used censorship to eliminate any dissenting voices or alternative viewpoints. Yeah, sounds kind of eerily familiar, doesn't it? Historian Philip B. Canistero highlights that censorship in fascist Italy was comprehensive, extending to all forms of cultural expression and seeking to enforce ideological conformity. Now, number 5 on the list is North Korea from 1948 to present. This country remains one of the most closed societies in the world, with strict censorship being a cornerstone of its totalitarian regime. The government controls all media outlets, and the distribution of foreign publications or unauthorized information is strictly prohibited. The regime's leader, Kim Jong-un, he uses censorship to cultivate a personality cult and suppresses any form of dissent. Citizens there are only exposed to state-approved content that glorifies the ruling family and the regime's achievements while demonizing foreign nations, particularly South Korea and the United States. Now, as described by scholar Andrei Lankoff, North Korean censorship is about creating a completely isolated environment where the only source of information is the state, reinforcing the regime's narrative and preventing any alternative perspectives. Now, number 6 is contemporary Russia, going from 2000 to present. Since Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, Russia has experienced a resurgence of state control over the media and is increasing its censorship. Independent media outlets have been systematically shut down. Journalists critical of the government have been harassed or assassinated, and the internet is heavily monitored. The Russian government uses a combination of legal measures, such as the quote-unquote foreign agent law, and digital surveillance to suppress dissent and control the narrative. Scholar Maria Lipman argues that censorship in contemporary Russia is subtle but pervasive, combining direct control with more sophisticated forms of pressure and self-censorship. Now, can you think of any instance or many instances where our current government, working in partnership with social media platforms, as well as the legacy mainstream media, wanted to eliminate any ideas that could challenge the narrative being pushed by the government and the government's quote-unquote medical professionals? Or when speaking about election fraud? Sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Now, last week, the CEO of Meta, or Facebook, Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, exposed in a letter that he was in fact pressured by the United States government to suppress information about the Hunter Biden laptop story in the run-up to the 2020 election. Many on the right, including elected officials in Congress, are pleased as punch about that announcement, and the people now want his head on a platter. Figuratively, folks. Of course, we cannot forget the role Facebook played in that situation, as well as many others who have not admitted to it yet, but we're demanding our pound of flesh from the wrong people. It was the government, the institution put into place to secure the people's liberty, as well as the government that has constitutional restrictions against restricting the people's God-given right of free speech. It was those people that pressured Zuckerberg into doing what he did. Does that not sound like each one of the 6 examples of totalitarian governments censoring free speech? Of course it does. And our anger needs to be directed at the people in Washington, D.C., and our state capitals for allowing it to happen. It wasn't one man living in California that censored our speech. It was our state and national governments that either did it implicitly through direct pressure, Washington, D.C., or complicitly through inaction, state governments. On another note, with the government pressuring these social media sites to enforce the government narrative around news and information, they created their own back door to the Constitution. That whole situation has the Ministry of Popular Culture that Mussolini had in fascist Italy. Sound quite familiar, don't you think? Or our very own Department of Homeland Security setting up its own Disinformation Governance Board a while back. There's something else I need to address too, and this is based upon the term book ban and Nazis and how the commies are trying to paint organizations such as Moms for Liberty, along with other conservative organizations, as book banners and book burners. I touched on it a bit last week and definitely got into it with some of the die-hard commies on social media this week. They are attempting, along with the Biden administration, as trying to portray these conservatives as equal to Nazis by their book bans. There is a way to counter that argument as well as point out their own hypocrisy, folks. Ask them if they can still purchase any one of those books that normal, concerned parents want removed from government school libraries. The answer is yes, they can still be purchased. So those books have not been banned, nor have they been burned. Then ask them if they banned an image of the Native American woman from the land of Lake's butter, or Aunt Jemima from syrup bottles, or Uncle Ben from rice packages. Or how about changing the name of the Washington Redskins to the Washington Commanders, or the Cleveland Indians to the Cleveland Guardians? Can you purchase those items with those images and logos anymore? So, who is really doing the banning here, folks? From the 6 examples of totalitarian governments that we discussed earlier, we can conclude that throughout history, totalitarian regimes have used censorship as a fundamental tool to maintain control over their populations. By suppressing dissent, controlling information, and shaping public perception, these regimes seek to create an environment where their authority is unquestionable and their ideology is unchallenged. Brings to mind a phrase, I am science. You should know who that means. From Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to communist China, fascist Italy, North Korea, and contemporary Russia, censorship remains a key strategy in the arsenal of authoritarian rule. And our government, the United States of America's government, appears to be a good student of history because that is what we are seeing at all levels right now. For now, though, that closes out this segment. I'll be right back after the break with my closing thoughts after God's Word. So stay tuned. I'll be right back. As always, folks, thank you for tuning in this week. The threats to our national security, which are threats to our liberty, are mounting every day, heck, every minute of every hour of every day. The threats to our liberty that are coming at us in the form of national debt, brought on by government spending, in the form of our state governments picking winners and losers in the free market by gambling with our money, and most especially in the form of the government working to silence speech and points of view that it does not agree with. All of those threats are brought about by people in office that do not lead from a position of selflessness, but a position of selfishness. As I previously mentioned, these threats to our liberty that surround us every day, they are there because our government hates us and it does not respect us. The citizens of this country are no longer politically feared. The new aristocracy's work at dividing us has provided them with the desired effect. That effect being they can, and often do, pass whatever legislation is needed or take any other action, even unconstitutional actions, all to maintain their positions of power. Because what they have learned to count on is the apathy of the electorate. Rarely is an incumbent defeated in an election, especially in off-year elections, and most especially in local elections. One of the questions that a prominent person in the conservative space asks quite frequently is this: has it gotten bad enough yet? I don't think so. But when it does get bad enough, the consequences of that will be severe for all parties involved. Not only for the new aristocracy and the activists on both sides of the political spectrum, but also for the people that just want to be left alone. The clock is ticking, and for a vast majority of the citizens, they cannot hear or see the clock as it approaches 0 hour. And now for some wisdom from God's Word. This week it comes to us from the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verse 20, where our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ spoke these words: "Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed." Elected officials at every level are discovering, because they no longer politically fear the electorate, that they no longer care if their deeds are exposed. As I discussed earlier when talking about my interaction with individuals on the commie side of the political spectrum, they don't care that the government censored its citizens. They believe the government did it for the right reasons, which is to silence facts that do not fit with their worldview. They also do not care that the government is racking up enormous amounts of debt in the people's names. They believe the government is doing that for the right reasons as well. These communists, a small but very loud portion of society, truly believe that government is God and all our rights come from it and can be taken from the people by it, all to advance their political and religious ideology. It is imperative that you all become constitutional activists and start waking people up, especially those that consider themselves Christians and have stayed out of the fight. If Christians are not engaged with politics, decisions will be and are being made by people who think God is irrelevant and the truth of God's word does not exist, which in turn means that the foundation of our nation's creation, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which were written based upon Christian principles, it means those documents are irrelevant as well. Something to think about. So until next week, stand in the arena with me. Reveille, it's time to wake up.